So hello everyone and welcome. This is Biltor Uluçay from RestartLab. I call myself the youngest and sure the oldest member of the group. First of all, thanks for your interest and being here with us this evening. I hope everyone's doing well. I don't see any faces saying yes, I'm great, but I see some, yes, great. So as RestartLab, we hope that you'll enjoy today's session and have a memorable experience. This will be our 8th webinar since our foundation last year. And before on moving to the session and introducing our guest speaker, I want to provide some brief information about our organization. RestartLab, as we like to call it, is a cross-industry think tank initiative. We question the work concepts which we are used to today. We are exploring alternative organizational models and human-centric working environments, also looking deep into the dark side of traditional ways of working and challenge the status quo. That said, we want to redefine the concept of work. Today, there are organizations around the world from many different industries which consist of self-managing teams. They all aim to be more human-centric and continue to succeed with their happy and committed employees. So we believe that sharing these experiences will inspire us too. As part of this spectacular journey, we have organized tonight's RestartLab event to get the reflections of such an enlightenment from a transformation architect, an inspiration speaker, a story collector, and a co-creator. Now, I am pleased to introduce you our guest, Timm Urschinger. Hello, Timm.
Hi, hello. Thanks for the invite.
Willkommen, I should say. It's a pleasure to see you here with us. And I hope you're great and well as well. So, maybe I should start also providing some background about Timm. Although he wears different hats within the corporate scene, I would like to mention two of them, and we'll leave the rest to Timm for his speech. Firstly, he is the co-founder and the socializer of Life Sciences. Life Sciences is a Swiss consulting company which has a strong belief that they can make the corporate world a better one. Their motto is catalyze the success within the corporate world. I believe it sounds nice, everyone. I think so. And Life Sciences also defines itself as a radically self-organized and teal-grounded company, embracing self-responsibility and wholeness as core values, also stating that they are completely horizontal and highly empowered team, which walks the talk. And secondly, Timm is a member of the Teal Network, a diverse group of Teal practitioners from America, China, and Europe. He is also the core creator of the global event, Teal Around the World Conference. This annual conference aims to bring like-minded people together and create a virtual platform for exchange and inspiration to explore, engage, and shape a human-centric future with their participants. So after Timm's presentation, we will have time to discuss around your questions with Timm. So please share your questions via Slido. You can find the link on the chat section. Now I stop here and leave the floor to Timm. Here you are.
Perfect. Thanks, Bilto. Pleasure to be here. And if we talk about the Teal around the world, we do have some star guests here in the audience as well. Just saying, we got an ex-Teal around the world speaker here, Tina, right? So don't hide. So there's also that kind of exchange and conversation that I'm always looking for. I mean, I'll tell you a few stories about us, about Life Sciences. It's by no means the truth or the path that you should follow. It's just some things that we've tried and that somehow worked for us so far. Sometimes more, sometimes less, I guess. Anyway, so always looking for conversation and obviously looking forward to to that after a little short input. And let me see, I should be able to share my screen. There we go. I hope you can see my slides here. That should work.
Yes.
Really good. So just a bit of background about us so that you know or can like, see a little bit who we are, what we are doing and all that. Bilto mentioned a few things already. I think for us, the whole journey started around 2015, which was when I was frustrated with my more or less corporate job in the other environment with a more traditional consultancy, and also before that worked for Big Pharma. So frustrated enough anyway to leave and do something else. And just by chance, I came across the book Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, which was somewhere between naive and exciting for me at that point in time, I must say, just knowing other structures and kind of more orange structures. We want to use that language. Anyway, it was good enough to try out, try to get our head around how it might look like for us, looked into holacracy, sociocracy, and also the other things that were out there already in 2015. And that's why I said, well, it's kind of path finding and trying to see what works in this teal world. Also because obviously, if you know Frederick's book, it's not like that's the framework, that's the thing you can copy paste, right? It's more inspiration and a collection of experiences. So that's what we tried as well. We are what we say radically self-organized. I'll talk a little bit about that. On the right-hand side of the picture, you see our cow. So we do have a cow because we're a proper Swiss company. Of course, we have a cow and we get cheese and all that. And then you see the team as well. The bottom picture is what we call our purpose sharing session. That's probably one of the most emotional, deep moments of the years, like everyone sharing their personal purpose and kind of reflecting on their meaning in life. And if it's in the Swiss Alps, then it's obviously a nice scenery with all the sunset and all that. So that's what you see bottom picture. And top right, this little picture, I'll explain a little bit later what's called Lifeline over there. So that's us. Lifeline is, by the way, also online if you want to have a look at that later. Kind of our ways of working collection to a certain extent. So what's the shifts we try to make for everyone? I'm not sure if everyone knows Teal and Reinventing Organizations and what Frederick did. So I thought I'll just really briefly recap on some of these things. So what you see on the right-hand side is the different layers, in a sense, that Frederick's introducing there, also inspired by spiral dynamics. So for the ones who know spiral dynamics, you'll probably know some of these color codings and so on. So what we see, and that's really just in a nutshell, what we see in the corporate world mostly is this orange layer, that middle one. It's about competition, about profit, management by objectives, all of these kind of things. And I guess what we are trying also with our ideas to make some of these shifts happen that you see on the left-hand side, looking at a more purpose-driven organization that can be combined with a profitable organization, obviously, to moving away from hierarchical ideas and top-down leadership more to a network of teams, to self-organization, to supportive leadership, these kind of things, experimenting rather than planning 3-year waterfall projects, distributed decision-making, a lot of transparency, and Bilto, you mentioned a few things already. So that's all the things that we look into for us as well, and that's how we are using Teal in a sense. So what does it mean for us? Really concretely, why do we say radically self-organized? For some of you guys, it probably sounds radical, especially if you're working for big corporations. We don't have an org chart, or maybe rather the org chart is what you see on the right-hand side. That's what it looks like. Some of you more holacracy-focused folks will recognize that's Hola Spirit, the tool that we are using there. Role-based working, we can talk a little bit about that. We don't have line managers, obviously. There's no hierarchy, or no hierarchy by structure, at least. We do have full transparency. That includes salaries, and the reason is pretty simple, because we do also have a practice that we call self-set salaries. Currently in the process again, October, November is the time frame for next year. We're kind of deciding on our salaries. So we are going through that process. Everyone's setting their salaries themselves, completely free range, no levels, no containers, no whatever you have, ranges or something. It's just self-set salaries, which sounds nice in the beginning. If you're in that process, it's actually pretty demanding, and it's always interesting tension-based times, I would say. Anyway, it's good fun, that self-set salary stuff. The important thing still to mention, obviously, all of this doesn't mean no structure, and it doesn't mean no processes, and certainly doesn't mean no leadership. In every human system with more than 2 people, you always have leadership. And that's also fine. It's just more fluid compared to these hierarchical, I am the boss and that's why I should be leading and that kind of stuff. It's just more fluid. But we do have leadership. We do have people who have more experience in certain areas. For example, we do have people who have more passion for certain areas than others do. And already their leadership will emerge, pretty sure. And for the structure and the processes, I mean, maybe taking the self-set salaries as an example, everyone's setting their salary themselves with no boundaries, and there is a process behind. So we are following, if you know Frederick or some of the sociocratic ideas, we are following the advice process there. So single decision making based on advices and inputs. So there is a process, there is a structure, and it's completely autonomous. So that's one of the teal ideas that we live by pretty radically, I would say. Structure provides autonomy and freedom. Sounds a bit like a paradox, but structure provides you with freedom. That's the whole idea. The other part that you see is lifeline. I already mentioned that on the other picture too. It's kind of how we look at the world, values, principles, key agreements. How do we think collaboration should look like? Also trying to explain how we look at some of these more traditional concepts like objectives and, you know, KPIs and these kind of things. So it's all explained in there, relatively short, whatever, 10, 12 pages, something, just trying to summarize how we look at the world. Really helpful for alignment of the team as well. And obviously also for onboarding and these typical things that we're doing too. That's helpful. So that's the base setup in a sense. Yeah. Other than that, there's a few traditional things that you'll find in our setup too. We have, for example, cash flow as KPIs. We have a pipeline, you know, for sales things. We do have, I don't know, employee data that we need to submit to insurances, you know, so there's always that part where it's just functioning like every other company too. And the big difference, I guess, comes from the role-based working that you see on the right-hand side. Maybe before going next step, any questions already, or any comments, anything that you would find interesting to dive deeper into? And I don't have the slide you open, so we can also take that later, of course.
Yeah.
Cool. Good. Then let's continue. So there's also that part where somebody lately, and actually from the Teal Around the World team, asked me in 3 categories: exciting, scary, worth a try. What's the reflections, Tim? So I was like, well, that's actually some reflections that you guys might be interested in as well. So why is this whole process exciting? Why is this whole self-organization thing actually exciting, or at least for me? And one thing is, I got time for what really matters and what really interests me. So compared to my job before, part of a traditional consultancy, leading a team, you know, being the account manager for something. I've in 2015, the last year that I was there, I've signed off more than 1,000 expense sheets in just 1 year. So, you know, highly paid manager signing off 1,000 expense sheets. That's incredibly boring, I can tell you. You don't find anything anyway. This is just boring. And obviously also not value providing for the company. But what I have here is I finally have the time for what really matters. And I can decide obviously what matters for me. So that's nice. And that's this freedom that I do enjoy. And all this admin is just something that I have to decide because I'm up the hierarchy. Stuff is just not there. So I do enjoy that a lot. Obviously also nice knowing that I'm not alone on this journey. Some people, and I think Tina knows as well, and some others who know me a little bit, is like, I always say I'm a control freak, and I am in fact really a control freak. So control freak, self-organization, not always going well together. And I know that there's certain patterns, you know, that I'm working on. But then again, I'm not alone on the journey, at least that. So that's also positive and exciting. And then I think, Bilte, you mentioned already, I think there's a shift in the world. There's an interest in these topics. There's a recognition also with COVID. I think it's accelerated even, where we say we just can't continue the way we've come here. There needs to be other things, that we need to look at climate change, sustainable ways of working and operating our industries, you know. So there's so many things that we need to look into. And I think seeing that shift in the world, I would say we are not naive enough to say we are changing the world, but we are at least a puzzle piece maybe in that whole game. And it's good to see that there's a shift and that there's an interest in the topic. And then the Halloween scary part. Well, losing control for control freak, that's a bit scary, I can tell you. So there's also ways around having or being in control all the time, you know. But there's also that part where I think structure is pretty important. As I said, I can't control what salary numbers come up, but obviously there's a certain structure and I trust the process. So that's I think a good thing, and that's something if you work with other people, with leaders maybe, giving them something that they don't need to lose or feels like losing control completely is probably a good thing. Another one that's difficult for me always is kind of, I mean, I've been doing consultancy for more than a decade now, and kind of this, I've been there, I've done that, I can tell you that's not going to work, right? And you know, it will be a massive wall that you're hitting there. And then the team sometimes still decides to go and walk exactly that path, and I'm just saying like, but that's waste of time and money and everything, you know. I mean, tried that before, as I said, and it's not going to work. So that is still difficult to let go of these ideas and thoughts. And you know, the good thing is sometimes it is a wall, of course, right? Sometimes it's just good to build on experiences. But then again, most of the time, actually, it's not a wall, and they find ways around it and they do it slightly differently, or maybe it's even working now what I tried before some 10 years back. So it's also good to see that this whole been there, done that, knowing everything is actually wrong, full stop. Right? But still in the process, it's still a bit scary here and there. And then, yeah, I mean, there's also situations, for example, in 2019, Q1 was relatively bad for us, relatively red numbers as well. And I'd say we were kind of a bunch of headless chicken in that quarter, discussing stuff that wasn't necessarily helpful. And I was thinking back about my kind of more corporate career, and I wouldn't even have told my team. Right, I just would have kept it for myself. There was no transparency. I would have decided. We probably wouldn't have been a bunch of headless chicken. And this control and directive management in that situation would have been more efficient, certainly. Not so sure if more effective, but definitely more efficient. And then obviously the organizational learning was really good in that setup compared to the other one. But that's also not easy. And especially some 2 years back, that was one of the more cumbersome moments in that self-org life for me, at least. And then again, what's the advice I can give you? Good enough for now, safe enough to try. Always a good one. I think we're doing that quite a lot, and that's just something that helps. Also, just do it. Just don't try to understand everything intellectually. Our intellect is limited to a certain extent, at least if we talk about that brain part of the intellect. So just do it is always a good thing. And then also dare to fail. I mean, we've had failures. We had some expensive failures as well as a team, but that's also fine. It's part of the learning. It's part of the journey. And in that case, that's actually worth a try still anyway. So that's that part that I would say. And yeah, it's certainly not a perfect journey, but then again, probably letting go of that perfectionism is the other thing that you should have. There's more stuff that I can share later with you. That's probably too busy, but this is the one that I thought I would be sharing with you. Some patterns that we saw also with some of our clients. And I'm sure some of you here in the audience also know. So there's that part where, if we start here at top, creating structures to trying to control is the wrong way. Right? You need to create structures to create freedom and autonomy. I think I mentioned that before. So that's a major shift, I think. And at the same time, structure is a great enabler for behaviors or against these, obviously, as well. Right? So you can talk about empowerment as long as you want. If you create micromanaging type of structures in portfolio processes, in budgeting processes, and whatever, you will not get too far. And at the same time, I mean, there is a mindset aspect to it, and somewhere in the bottom it also says outer work requires inner work. But then again, you can also help and enable people to develop certain behaviors based on your structure. So kind of nudging them in a friendly way into some different behaviors. So structure, I think, is a good one to look into for whatever teal self-organized kind of organization. I already mentioned here at the bottom, outer work requires inner work. And I know some people here are probably much better on that than I am here. But yeah, so there's that part. Working on yourself, working with yourself, going on your own personal development journey is probably one of the more uncomfortable, cumbersome processes. And it's the one that's probably paying off the most personally, and obviously also from an organizational perspective. If you don't know who you are and why you are who you are, it's just getting incredibly difficult for certain of the self-organizing aspects. For example, self-set salaries. If you don't have an answer to your self-worth and what you're valuing and all that, self-set salaries will be a tricky one for sure. So that's just the other one. The other things, if you're more part of a bigger organization, this whole agility things and all that. I mean, one thing that that I've also learned in this 2019 example that I just mentioned. There's kind of 3 steps to this whole self-organization, making it work. And one thing is, people need to understand that they actually are allowed to take the accountability and take decisions. So even in our setup, experience shows it takes a few weeks, month maybe, to figure that out. I am allowed to take that decision. And especially if they're coming from big corporations, it's a bit strange for them in the beginning. It's like, can I really decide everything? I mean, without asking anyone and stuff. And so figuring out I am allowed to do it, step 1, right? Step 2, do I really want to take the accountability? I mean, especially with a high transparency like in our setup, it's also uncomfortable because people will figure out that decision that Timm just took, that just costed us 300K. So that's an impact on our profit. That's an impact on my bonus maybe as well, right? So all of these things. So do I really want to take the accountability? So allowed to, want to take the accountability. That's partially a tricky one. And if you're looking into big corporations, then certainly one of the most tricky ones, I would say. And then third step would be, do I actually know how to take on this accountability? Have I been exposed to, I don't know, financial budgeting processes before? Do I actually know what to do with these? Because if not, and you just kind of let loose, it's probably ending into chaos and not into something that's really useful for the team or myself. So that's definitely also something to look into. How do you build that capability? How do you make sure that people actually get trained and skilled? And there's one part looking at it from an organizational perspective where it's not effective, but then also you're running the risk of overwhelming people massively. So if I look into our setup, again, many people joining the team from bigger corporations. So they're doing consultancy the first time, maybe. They're certainly working in a self-organized setup the first time. And they have to prioritize and, take accountability for their actions. So it's 3 things, all kind of from day one. And it's incredibly overwhelming. So there's also something to think about. How do you kind of build a support system from the team that they're actually somehow caught, that they're somehow supported enough that they don't feel completely overwhelmed. And that's one of the key things I think to have in mind as well. So that's just some things to mention. I think we said we'll do roughly half an hour. So that's half an hour. That's the last slide, and then we'll go into questions, I would say, Bill, right?
Thank you very much, Timm. Yeah, that would be great to have this, presentation afterwards. Sure. Thank you very much. So I go to Slido now and see the questions. Okay. There are some things that you have already mentioned. One question is, maybe I should start with this one. Do you think most companies will be self-managed someday, or will it always be an alternative to the conventional management? How do you feel after you have worked so far in the markets and in the organizations, including yourself?
Difficult one. So I would say the hope is yes. Because I do think that there's some good things coming from that way of organizing compared to more traditional ways of organizing, especially if I look into society and our impact that we're having on the ecosystem around us. Then I do think that less ego-driven corporate decisions will be helpful for all of us, actually. Then again, do I believe that this is the way companies will be organized if you look, I don't know, 10 years from now? And that part is a bit more difficult, of course, just because it's useful and I think it would be nice doesn't mean that's happening. If you look into these transformations that are happening in some of the big corporations like Roche Pharma, like ING Bank, like, these big names that we all know, then there's one thing always happening. There are some let's say more ego-driven practices in all of these companies and systems. And as soon as you try to take away that control from these ego-driven systems, kind of the immune system kicks in, right? And there's an immune reaction to the changes that you're trying to create. So in that sense, these transformations are not necessarily straightforward. They're not quick for sure. I just had a chat with one of the ING executives as well, where it's even the tendency that the pendulum is swinging back now, right? So they've even been further in the process some two years back if you compare it to now. So it's interesting to see. I do believe that we'll more and more look into different ways of organizing. That's happening already across the board. I'd say it's not necessarily always self-organization. It's certainly not always teal, but there is a recognition that we need different ways of organizing. So that's definitely a yes. And the rest, fingers crossed.
Okay, then another one here. Maybe a bit related to what you have, spoken so far. You mentioned a kind of tension in your talk. Do you see or use that kind of tension as a productive tool?
Totally. I do think that the tensions is at the core of how we organize and how we look at the world. In German language and also in English, actually, and in many languages, tension is negatively connotated.
Yeah.
Right? So it's always perceived as something negative. So what we are trying as well is we are looking at it from a more kind of physics point of view. So tension is just a gap in potential. Right? Lightning is actually the same. It's just a gap in potential. It's nothing else. And a gap in potential is actually not that negative anymore. Right? And if you look at tensions as a gap in potential or actually an opportunity to improve the system, if it's a systemic one, or to develop and work on myself, if it's a personal tension, then tension is actually perfectly fine. So from a systemic perspective, and you see that in holacracy and sociocracy as well, tension-based improvement of whatever governance system you have with roles and all of this makes a lot of sense. I also believe that like personal conflict, or the other way around, maybe harmony is created through constructive conflict. It's not created through we don't speak about the stuff that bothers me. So in that sense, tension is really kind of a helpful cleansing type of process too. And I think it's not always about agreeing about all of these things, but it is about getting to know each other, understanding everyone's needs, and then catering for that. That's what mostly happens with personal conflict anyway. It's not like I'm right and you're wrong. It's more like we probably have different needs. Maybe there's different beliefs behind or different values or something. I mean, we've all had certain experiences, upbringing, school, university, other jobs, so that's always part of the system. So it's just good to understand these things. And if you look at tensions like that, I do believe it's incredibly helpful. And for example, for us, we have a bi-weekly tension meeting where we spend an hour together as a team just talking about our tensions, nothing else. It's the only agenda item is tensions, and that's also been really helpful to give it a proper platform and a proper container, actually.
Okay, so Timm, by the way, sorry for the participants, but I'll put my own question here.
It's okay.
What I've seen in your presentation, you have mentioned about investing in skills and capabilities to support this, transformation. So, what can you share about those with us?
One of my favorite examples is a medical device company in Basel that are doing dental stuff. So if you have whatever dental devices in your mouth because of some kind of accident or so, that's probably from the guys in Basel. A company called Straumann. There are roughly 8,000 people now, and sometime back when I was more in touch with them was like 4,000, 5,000. Anyway, what they've done, and I think they're still doing, in fact, is they all went through a financial training every year. So the executive guys, the CFO and so on, they've provided a financial training to everyone in the company. So why is that? Two reasons. One of their biggest objectives, and I think that's still the objective, is we don't want to get bought up by a big company like Johnson & Johnson or whatever. We want to stay independent. One good thing. So shareholder value, share price, and that is an important tool to understand if you want to stay independent these days. Kind of the company needs to be expensive enough so it's not attractive to be bought. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that they said, well, if we want to push down decision making, so they're still relatively hierarchically organized, it's just more autonomy. So they push down decision making to where the people actually understand what they're talking about. And they said, if you are supposed to take decisions by yourself, you need to understand to a certain extent how our financial system works, because otherwise it will have a negative impact on share price, and we want to stay independent. So we shouldn't kind of jeopardize that. So that's an amazing example. I think every year going through that financial training to refresh, make sure people understand the whole shareholder value formulas kind of behind the whole calculation is just a good idea if you want to have them take sensible financial decisions. And that's just one example. I mean, for us, we're spending quite a bit of time talking about how our financial system works. We're talking about these KPIs that we are having around cash flow. We've done quite a lot of exchange and conversation, and probably most of the time also a bit fun with some beer involved or so around kind of the tribal knowledge, because the company is growing, the team is growing, and some of us have been around for a bit longer, like obviously myself founding the company, and some others are a bit newer to the company. And we just didn't want to write down everything that we've done the last 5-6 years, right? And most of it's irrelevant anyway. And then again, this whole tribal knowledge, how do you make sure that this is still there, right? If you want to scale a company, you need to think about these topics as well. So that's also part of the capability building, for me at least. And then maybe the last example would be decision making generally. Do you know other ways than a consensus decision process? Do people understand how consent decision works? Do they understand what kind of data they can look into, what kind of implications certain decisions have? Also, that is capability building. Are you able to analyze certain things or not? So there's all of these topics. So there's a plethora of things that you could do, and I think it's always good on the job to a certain extent, a bit like mentoring approach, but then certain topics are probably good to just have a proper training around.
Okay, thank you very much. So now go back to Slido, just a second. Oh. This is interesting. 2 questions. One is, do you know any self-organized company, maybe you have already mentioned a bit, but transformed back to the traditional way?
So what does traditional way mean? I mean, more hierarchical? Or,
yeah, of course.
I guess. Yeah.
And the reasons behind that, if you know any, of course.
I mean, one thing is what I already mentioned is kind of this crisis thing, right? Where I had my moments as well, where it's like that whole self-organization thing it's just inefficient, and I'm just not patient enough, and I want to just take the decisions and done. Right? So there's that part. I think especially in crisis situation, we also, as human beings, kind of how we are genetically coded, crisis or high pressure stress situations, we fall back to patterns that we know. Right? So kind of saber-toothed tiger in front of me, flee. Right? That's just hard-coded patterns, and that's true for the crisis situations in organizations as well, or situations where it's a bit tougher. I think we've seen it also in COVID in many of our organizations that we work with, for COVID task forces and decisions and everything, kind of falling back to more traditional things, I would say. And again, I totally understand that from the 2019 situation as well. So I would say crisis. Maybe the other thing to think about as well is, obviously, if you look at the corporate world or the more orange world, we are usually creating islands of self-organization, or islands of teal, or islands of more conscious organizations. You don't usually create 100,000 people company and that's all of a sudden a conscious organization or something like that, right? Which also means if you have changes in your leadership team, in the board, in whatever, then you usually have a tendency that you'll probably get the orange folks back to a certain extent. And every change in system will, like from people perspective, will make the system change again. And especially if you look into corporate systems, if you exchange the board of directors, they don't believe in your teal ideas, it's relatively quick that the things will probably, at least to a certain extent, swing back to a more traditional approach.
Okay, thank you. Another one is, this is about your company as well, Life Sciences. How do we lead to shift to self-set salaries? An interesting subject, as you might guess.
Yeah. So first of all, if you have a bigger corporation or anything, don't do it. Full stop. Just don't. That will probably not work. And it's anyway probably not the first step. Right? So there's so many other things on a more day-to-day basis. I mean, the reason for us to look into it in the beginning was pretty simple. We said we want to be self-organized. We want to have everyone take decisions on almost anything at any point in time. So why not on salaries? Just because people think it's sensitive or a bit of sensible data and stuff, that can't be a good reason to not try it out in a sense. And then the other thing is, at least from my experience from this other consultancy that I mentioned before, we had this process, that typical traditional salary process. We were sitting there in a room, management team of 12 people, 11 men, of course, and one woman, right? Typical management team setup as well. Anyway, so we were sitting in that room discussing salary and salary increases for the next year for 120 consultants, out of which I've probably worked with 20 if I'm lucky, right? Probably less than that. Anyway, sitting there, 12 people discussing salaries increases for the next year for 120 people. And then announcing that to the team some point in time leads to a ton of frustration. Everyone's unhappy with their salary, of course. Plus, officially, they don't know about each other. But then again, they're talking to each other, as we also know, right? It's just what human beings do. And then as a manager, I have at least it felt like 11 months of the year I had whatever frustrations about salaries, and people would complain about it all year long. So that was my experience from more traditional salary processes. And I just didn't think that this was useful whatsoever. Not for me as a manager, not for the company, not for the team, for nobody, basically. And self-set salaries is, as I said, a demanding process for like a 6-8 week period of the year when we go through our advice process and reflect, on these kind of things. And for example, last week we talked a little bit about our money stories and the beliefs behind and all that from a personal perspective. So that's always demanding weeks. But then again, the rest of the year is just quiet. And nobody is frustrated about the salary because I set my salary myself. So worst case, I can be frustrated with myself, and that's perfectly fine. But then again, it probably doesn't affect the system that much. So that's okay in a way. And of course, we did have tensions, especially after what we call the announcement meeting. There's always a little bit of tension here and there, where I'm thinking, well, actually build a I'm not sure if you really should earn 150,000. I think that's a bit too much. These kind of conversations, perfectly fine. And then you have a tension conversation. Usually it's all fine. But yeah, so self-set salary is a bit tricky. If you ask me how to get there, I mean, there's a few companies doing it. It's not like we're the only crazy ones. There's a German company called Einhorn, for example. They're fairly progressive on that topic as well. And there's many other companies who are trying out things. So probably reading up on these topics, how did they structure their processes? What's the kind of foundation that you need to a certain extent? I would say psychological safety is really important. Do people there and feel safe enough to speak up if they have tensions? Because otherwise you got exactly that same issue like with the traditional process. I think it's completely unfair. And then I'm not feeling safe enough to speak up, and then it's just affecting the system. So I know it doesn't probably really answer the question. It's also a bit like it's not like a step-by-step approach.
No, Tim, may I ask something about this? So
Sure.
When you decided to go for self-set salaries, did you start it first with opening and making it all transparent, the actual salaries, and how do people face with it? What was the reaction, and how did you take the next steps?
So definitely need to make the salaries transparent. The thing for us is our salaries were always transparent, so that's a bit not a perfect case. So we always had that. From Swiss law, you also need to sign an amendment to the normal working contract that you're okay with salary being transparent. So just legally, that's the other part. But yeah, it was always transparent. When we talk to some of the clients, they're looking into as a first step, kind of in the background, cleaning up all of the gender pay gaps and, you know, all of these historically grown differences in salaries and all of that kind of stuff. So kind of cleaning it up in the back end with a little HR team without trying to create a bigger mess. And then second step, making it transparent. That's already helpful. But then again, the bigger your organization gets, it's incredibly difficult.
And maybe one more thing. What was the result? So is there any significant increase in the total salaries?
Yeah. Always
Or
hard
maybe
to say.
decrease.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. So it's always hard to say. So we had people decreasing their salary. So we've had these cases. I mean, it's always difficult to say without bias, but if I look at our salaries, I would say tendencies that they're lower compared to the traditional experience that I had before, because people are less negotiating. They're also, I mean, obviously it's also transparent, right? I mean, if you as my boss and I know that I'm earning a shitload of money, or if everyone in the team knows, then, you know, there's the peer pressure thing is kicking in and people know that I get looked at. So there's also that controlling factor in a sense. And I think the most important one still is people understand our financial mechanics. People understand how that company works financially, right? It's not like you invoice something to the customer and kind of the same amount of money ends up on your bank account, that on your personal bank account. That's not how company works. So I think that understanding combined with all the other things, I'd say we are reasonably okay, probably on the lower end on certain ways. The other question that we always have, what about gender pay gap? Are we actually closing the gender pay gap with self-set salaries, or is it increasing it? You know, don't really have data on that, but it's definitely an interesting reflection as well. What does it do from a gender perspective, the whole self-set salaries? And I don't have an answer, so just guessing.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes more. There are more and more questions coming, but one is, and I think this is relevant to what you have spoken so far from some perspective, and it is about the tools that are used to evaluate new members during hiring. How is it decided that the new team members will be a good fit for the self-organized companies and tools?
Good question. I think I've had that conversation the last year or two about 20 times with some people in the team. So it's just funny how that's coming back. So we don't have too much of a structured process. What we do have is we are clear on decision making. So we know how decision making works for hiring. It's always at least 3 people involved in any kind of recruiting decision. So it's what we call a recruiting panel. What kind of criteria they're using, how they evaluate if that's a fit or not, completely open. Right? So there's no whatever criteria list or something that you have to tick off. But then again, on the other hand side, we do have conversations regularly about, well, what's the expectations? What is working for us as a team currently as well? What are the capabilities and skills that we are maybe missing as a team? So you can probably apply that to potential new hires as well in the recruiting space, of course. I'm currently having a conversation with a friend from outside the company who's an expert for recruiting and has written X amount of books, and he's like, you need to make sure that kind of the skills that you need for self-organization and the gap is not too big. So if it's that big of a gap, perfectly fine. You can develop that person. If that gap is that big, you probably just overwhelm them and burn them out, and it's not going to work. So that's something where we look into. I don't know how to get more conscious about it. I'm not necessarily convinced yet that it needs to be like an assessment properly done kind of thing. So we're still in conversation. What we tried a while, probably for about a year, was that everyone who was in this recruiting process, kind of interviewing with us, got a free 1.5 hour session with a coach. So we would pay for the coach, and the coach would help them reflect in that interview process from everything that they've heard, if that would be a good fit, just to go a bit deeper and kind of also independent. So not with us, but somebody who's like just helping them as a coach. That was actually quite successful. For some reason, we then said, not sure if that's really making the process better. So it was helpful in many ways for the interviewees, kind of on general reflections, but it didn't seem that we had a better recruiting choices made. So that was a bit tricky. So we stopped that again. But I guess we are still on a search lookout phase of what might be working there to kind of get a bit better on that process. Yeah.
Tim, just to understand, that coach, is it from company internal or a third party outside?
Third party outside.
What kind of a coach is that?
So just I don't know if there's a specific school, but like the typical personal coaching.
Okay. Now I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Then I go to Tina's question. How do you
before going into that question about the last one, Tim, in hiring process in self-managed companies, I think the balance of the attitude and the competency is different than the conventional companies, because mainly in enterprises, the main thing that they look for is the competency. But in self-managed companies, we always say that attitude is more important than competency. The other one is can be earned, but the first one is difficult to change. So what do you think about this balance?
Yeah. So definitely, if you look into our interviews and without having a script or anything, but I'd say the first question the first questions that get asked are usually around purpose. So trying to understand what's driving that individual, what's behind all of that. So usually it's a kind of a good purpose conversation in the beginning, and then obviously also kind of beliefs and values, what's important for you, what are you expecting from a company, what are you expecting from a team. So definitely on the softer side of things, attitude, soft skills, these kind of ideas, mindset, whatever we want to call it. So that's definitely the first part of the conversation. There is a part where we do need a certain skill set, of course, right? And where we also have a part where we try to explain what our day-to-day work looks like, so that they know what they're actually expecting if they're joining us. And that's pretty simple, because we do have clients who expect a certain level of quality. They expect certain services that we deliver. So obviously we need a skill set that's somehow matching. I'm with you that you can work on that. But also there's same question, how big is the gap? So if the client's expecting some, I don't know, coach, for example, and you say, you know what, Bilto is like the best purpose-driven mindset, 100% best guy on earth, but he has never done a coaching process. Then it gets difficult still. So there is a part. I don't know if you ask me for percentage, 2/3 mindset, purpose, 1/3 skills, maybe maximum, something like that.
Thank you.
So I follow with Tina's question. How do you make sure you have an emotionally safe and stable culture while dealing with constant transformation in a high degree of agility? Do you measure it?
If I would have an answer for that, Tina, then I would have dropped you a note already.
You're very welcome, Tim.
No, but it is a really good and really, really important question. So we do have, I think, constant conversations about, do we actually have that safe space? Do we think we have it? And then one thing, at least I observed, was the conversation shifted a little bit from, do we have a safe space, to, do I personally sense that for me it feels safe as part of the collective? And I think that's an important shift that has happened for us the last year, 1.5 something. It's not like there is a collective part of feeling safe, of course, and it's based on my personal needs and probably also certain biases, how I look at the world. So the solution, I guess, if you want to call it that way, is have enough conversations about it. Make sure we have room for these conversations about, do I feel safe? Do I feel valued as a team? These kind of topics. What are the tensions that I'm having? Do I feel completely stressed? So all of these topics do have a place. Now, does that mean it's always like happy, I'm feeling safe, and it's the best safe space that I could think of? Probably no. So we all have our ups and downs. That's part of being human, I think. But yeah, generally just making sure that you have that room, and also measuring is difficult. I think I'm not a fan of measuring culture or whatever. What we do have in our weekly meetings, for example, is what we call a stress level pendulum. It's just a little pendulum visual where you have 3 states, kind of completely stressed out, optimal, found my inner middle, or I'm completely bored and underutilized or whatever, right? So and then you just put your name on a post-it, on a virtual post-it, and say, subjectively, I'm super good or I'm stressed, and then you kind of see tendencies. I mean, we would know if Tina puts her sticky for the 5th week in a row on I'm completely stressed out, then most likely there's people reaching out and saying, Tina, should we have a little bit of chat? Like how can we support you? So these kind of things.
So you have roles for that.
We do have a role that's called lifeguard, which is kind of a wholeness purpose guard in a sense, but that person is really more I'm kind of sensing if there's anything completely wrong with the system. It's not always if I put stress for 5 weeks in a row that person would always reach out to me. But there's enough connection in the team that there's always 5 people at least reaching out if I have that issue anyway. So that's good. The lifeguard role is more making sure that we keep this topic top of mind, and also for offsites, for example, that we have proper space for these topics. Last time, so the one before the one last week, we had a fishbowl around these topics as well, where we, it's just the conversation is the key thing, I think.
Yeah, nice. Thanks.
Welcome.
So, Tim, time is running. There are some more questions. I will provide you with 3 questions. 3 questions. Okay. Choose 1 or 2 or 3 if you like. One is about the failures. Is there anything what you can you share about the failures that you faced with in your company or in the companies that you worked with so far? Okay, this is the first one. The second one is, this is the one that I have chosen from the bottom. And how do self-managed organizations put aside shareholders' expectations? Focus on purpose, values, or other things. And the third one is about the TL around the world. Our participant thanks to you and says that the conference was wonderful and asks, what is the vision for the TL around the world? 3 questions, and it's up to you.
Okay, I'll start with the easy one. The vision for TL around the world is just connecting people and communities and making kind of supporting the connection making and inspiration, and hopefully with that get a step closer to what we said before, this world where everyone's working in a different way, maybe. Next conference, 3rd and 4th of March. I just posted something today that Joost de Blok will be there again. So that should be some good reason. And maybe we talk to Tina as well if she shares a bit of her experience. That's already on the list. Anyway, so TL around the world, connecting people.
And I see that it's 75 Swiss francs for the early birds.
Yeah, correct. It's still early bird, indeed. Feel free. We also have something that we call pay forward. So for kind of the privileged first world countries, like for example Switzerland and so on, we also have around 20 tickets from last year still where people paid it forward. So if you can't afford it, drop us a note. We do have tickets. Okay, we just want to make sure that everyone can participate somehow. And it's anyway pro bono, so it's all good. Shareholder question is an interesting one for us. We are changing our shareholder model, a bit inspired by a guy called Aaron Dignan from The Ready in the US. They have a model where every employee is an owner of the company, and every year more shares get issued. So kind of the ones that are already there get diluted, and the ones who are still around in the company will earn shares. So the longer I'm with the company, the more shares I earn. What is interesting in their setup is that they do have investors. So there is investors investing into The Ready, and they get diluted every year because more shares are issued. So that's an interesting example how shareholder value is looked at differently, I guess. If you look at Larry Fink is always a kind of a prominent example from BlackRock. If you look at investment companies, they're demanding a bit more sustainable way of management and leadership and these kind of things. And then again, we have to be realistic. Shareholders are looking for return on their investments. I would argue, and if you look at Patagonia as one of the famous examples, of course, you can integrate purpose into profit, and you can be incredibly successful from an economical perspective and keep this way of working. And at the same time, realistic enough, if you're driven by quarterly shareholder results, these transformations, these kind of ways of working will not come naturally, and it's not an easy way. Certainly not. So that's that on the shareholders. Failures. Well, there's a ton of things that go wrong always. And one thing that we did completely wrong, like completely typical consultant mindset, right? So some 6 years back, we were like asking ourselves the question, what is the setup that we need to be successful, and what would it need to look like so it's sustainable for the next 3 years? Completely wrong question, completely stupid question. Took us half a year to figure out that it's the wrong question anyway. So the right question is, what do I need today to be successful as a team, and not anything else? Just focus on today rather than this futuristic stuff, especially if you look at how you're set up and how you're structuring. So that was the early failure. I think otherwise, I mean, there've been a ton of failures on certain things that we believed were the coolest ideas ever, and nobody was interested in it, well, it just didn't work. There was a product that was called Lifesaver, and we thought it was super smart and was just not going anywhere. But that's part of the game. So that's that. And then there's, I guess, personal things where Timm falling back into control freak habits, these kind of things happen too. So there's always things going wrong. I think the important thing is reflect, learn from it, and then improve, and then it's perfectly fine. And anyway, the other thing is, failure is not necessarily a plan B. Failure is actually plan A, because if you experiment and if you want to be innovative, you will likely experiment. So if you experiment, there will be things going on. That's kind of in the nature of experiments. So that's also an important one that you will find in the lifeline if you want to read it up. Experimentation requires you to fail to a certain extent, so it's perfectly fine to fail.
Thank you very much, Timm. If any comments from the participants, happy to have them, or we can close. And Timm, before leaving, one message for this evening, what would be that?
What's the one message for the evening? Don't wait for anyone else to change the world. Just do it yourself.
Thank you.
Easy as that.
Easy and very strong one. So thank you very much, Timm, and thank you to all participants for this nice gathering. And before you leave, closing the event, I would like to remind that you can go to our YouTube channel to listen to this webinar. We are going to reload it there. Thanks once again to Timm. And you can also see the previously recorded events as well. I also would like to encourage you all to follow us, RestartLab on LinkedIn, and visit our website, restartlab.io. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.